Welcome to Deal Doctor Live. It's Monday at 1, I guess we're 1:01, but we're pretty close. Anyway, I've got some good news, got some bad news. The good news is we're 1 full month into winter. The bad news is we have 2 more months to go. So, March equinox will occur on at 3:40 a.m. on March 20, 2 months from now. So far it hasn't been too bad, but it's winter. Some people like winter. I used to like winter, but all right. Today's topic is possession, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But before I get to that, Eric and I have been getting a rash of calls on terminating inspections. And I wanted to touch base on that just for a moment before we get into today's topic. Buyer on the Grand Rapids Association of Realtors form and on most of the other forms, it allows the buyer to terminate the contract based on inspections. Now, in GCAR, you have to provide some substantiation for it. In GRAR, you don't. In the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, WMLR and so on, you don't have to provide any justification for it whatsoever. You can simply say that the inspection, first of all, you have to have the inspection. It's not a get out of jail free card. Paragraph 15 is not a get out of jail free card. You have to have the inspections either performed by the buyer or someone of the buyer's choice. If the buyer decides that they want to get out of it, it is it offers a unilateral option to get out of the contract. So there are 2 forms that we ask you to fill out. One, an addendum terminating the contract based on inspections. And the reason is because of that it is a unilateral termination. Doesn't require the seller to agree to it. It only requires that the buyer has to sign it. And 2, a mutual release, which stipulates how the EMD is to be dispersed. Here's the tricky part. If you only submit a mutual release, it requires both signatures in order to be enforceable. Well, guess what? If you have the buyer sign it, but the seller says, well, no, I don't want to sign it because I want to get a hold of the earnest money deposit, then you may have an argument, and the question then is lingering whether or not the contract is still in force or not. So we beg you, please fill out 2 forms if your buyer wants to unilaterally terminate a contract based on inspections. 1, an addendum terminating the contract, and 2, the mutual release filled out as to how the EMD is going to be dispersed. Define inspection. Well, the inspections are whatever you want them to be. If your buyer wants to have plumbing, heating, electrical, structural, swimming pool inspection, if it's a time of year that it can be inspected, a chimney inspection, radon inspection, whatever inspections your buyer chooses to have, mold inspection, whatever it is, it's up to the buyer to choose which of those inspections they want. Now, investigations is a little bit different. Investigations in the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement stipulate 3 specific areas that the buyers can investigate. One is the insurability of the property. Another is the intended use of the property. And I can't remember the third one. However, most real estate attorneys will say that the investigations and inspections that a buyer has are pretty open-ended, that if an issue went to court and these investigations or inspections were performed within that 10-day period, a judge would probably allow that to be cause to terminate a contract if the buyer so chooses. For example, let's say that your buyer wrote an offer, a house was listed and advertised as school of choice. As most of you know, school of choice is not a real thing. It may be an option, it may be available, but every house is located in a particular school district. And the ability to exercise the option of school of choice is going to be based on, number one, if there is room in the school of choice, the school that you want to put the child in, the buyer wants to put the child in, and the school in which it actually belongs has to approve the release of that student to that school. So, for example, if you live in the city of Wyoming, and you're in the Wyoming school district, but you're right on the edge of Granville, and you want to go to Granville schools, the opportunity is going to be based, or the ability is going to be based on whether or not Granville has room and Wyoming is willing to give up that student's tax contribution. So, all of those kinds of investigations can be done within that 10-day window. But if there's a reason to terminate, what I want to focus on here right now is if there's a reason to terminate, it can be done unilaterally with an addendum, but you also have a mutual release to deal with the disbursement of the EMD. I can't seem to open Amanda's question there.
You can't see it?
No, it says, I had a buyer back out for inspections but never performed the actual inspection. He got something. He got cold feet.
There you go.
Because I was told the drive-by can be considered an inspection. Well, you'll get different opinions from attorneys on that. A drive-by may be not considered an inspection. Gail Anderson's position is that the purpose of an inspection, the intention of an inspection, is to find out information that the buyer didn't already know. Things that maybe the buyer doesn't have expertise about. Not to discover whether or not it has blue shingles, which you knew when you went to look at it the first time. So, a drive-by, that one's going to be tough in court. If you know that the buyer got cold feet, if the seller finds out that the reason they're backing out is because they got cold feet, that seller has a really, really good legal position to pursue that EMD. Hope that answers that. I don't want to spend much more time on that. I'm mainly focused on the fact that we need two forms, an addendum and a mutual release. Okay, let's get to the possession issue, today's topic. The possession, good, the bad, and the ugly. When should you talk about possession and the potential consequences? When a problem occurs? At the closing? When you're writing the offer? Or before you write the offer? I would hope that the answer is before you write the offer. And the reason is, it's important that you discuss the options and the consequences of both sides of the possession issue. If you're going to allow a seller to stay in the house for a period of time, whether that's 10 days, 30 days, whatever it is, are you going to charge for it? Are you going to ask for it? Do you want to make your offer strong, especially in a multiple offer situation, and not deal with escrow, well, if you don't want to ask for an escrow in case there's damages, then you have to explain to your buyer before you ever write the offer that there's a risk there. There's a risk that the buyer is assuming that everything's going to be okay. And that's not always the case. So, the time to have this conversation about whether you put together an escrow into the purchase agreement or not regarding possession is not when you're writing the offer or at the closing, and certainly it's too late when a problem occurs. Talk to them beforehand. Educate your buyers as to what they're going to encounter when it comes time. They found the house that they want, and it's time to sit down and write an offer. That they should be fully aware of what their options are at that point. Again, going back for those of you who came to Con Ed and for those of you who didn't, Sue Prinz brought up an excellent point that if you put an escrow agreement in to protect your buyer, you put it into the PA to protect them from any potential damages, it could cost your buyer the house because there may be other offers out there that don't have that, and the seller might find those more attractive. By the same token, you're not protecting your buyer because they could experience damages. The reason this came up as today's topic is over the weekend or the last several days, we saw a thread on Facebook talking about what's a reasonable expectation for an escrow if a buyer wants to put an escrow in place. Have the seller escrow funds for that possession period to make sure that there isn't any damages or they don't take appliances away, so on and so forth. The amount that was in question in the Facebook post was $10,000, that a buyer wanted a $10,000 escrow established by the seller to ensure that when the buyer took possession of the property, that they would be covered for any damages that may occur. Scratching a hardwood floor, taking appliances that are in the purchase agreement. And the consensus of many of the agents who spoke made comments was, that's ridiculous. $10,000 is way too high. Well, let me throw out a couple of things for you. This is a refrigerator. That's a $6,000 refrigerator. If you're selling a $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 house and it's got a $6,000 refrigerator, $10,000 doesn't sound like it's too high. Even worse, there's a refrigerator, stove, and microwave, and a range hood, $24,000. If you're selling real high-end homes, a $10,000 escrow is not out of line. In fact, I'll share one with one of our agents wrote up shortly. The amount that you determine if you're going to write an escrow, the amount that you determine is based in large part on what the value of the property is and what fixtures or elements, whether it's appliances and so on, what is the potential damage there? Well, if it has high-end appliances like Sub-Zero refrigerator and Wolf range, the cost could be pretty high if the seller decides to take those with them. What about if they have a chandelier or a hot tub? I had one where they took the hot tub that was a fixture. It was $3,000 to replace that. So the amount that you create in an escrow is largely to protect in situations where there may be debris not cleaned up very well, stuff left behind. But first of all, before I go down that road, let's talk about good possession. Good possession is where everything goes according to plan. No disagreements about when the keys are going to be delivered. No confusion about when the seller's personal property is to be removed. And the occupancy fee, if any, has been paid in full. Let me give you a big hint. Always settle the occupancy fee in full at closing, non-refundable. Never agree for a seller to pay a per diem after closing. First of all, it may be hard to get. Secondly, it leaves the seller with the power to stay in the house 3 or 4 days and hand the buyer a check for 3 or 4 days of possession. And the buyer has made a commitment to live in their apartment or their current home for the next 30 days and now is stuck with 2 payments. So always get the occupancy paid in full at the time of the closing, non-refundable. The good news is this. How often does everything go fine? Probably about 98% of the time. About 98% of the time, Eric and I talked this morning about some numbers, and we figured we might get 100 calls a year where somebody has left something in poor condition, or they've walked in and discovered damage or a wet basement or something. 98% or thereabouts of the transactions that we experienced last year went just fine. That's the good news. The bad news is that 2% is a real headache. So let's talk about bad possession. Bad possession. Buyer and seller disagree on the date the seller is supposed to vacate. This usually happens because at some point in the transaction, both parties don't establish a date that the keys are going to be exchanged and the utilities are going to be transferred. It's really important that at the very latest, it should happen at the closing, that you establish an exact date and time, and I would recommend that you do that in the form of an addendum. In fact, there's even a form for it. This form, we'll talk about it in a minute. Okay, so the most common misconception or the most common confusion is based on what are the days after. If you get possession 15 days after closing, what's the first day? Well, some people, buyers, and some agents think that the first day of the seller's possession is the day of closing. But according to the contract, it's based on the effective date. So the very first day of that 15 days after closing of possession is actually the first full day after the closing. That's where you get into a problem, is misunderstanding. Kim Baker's question: what happens with the escrow if there's a dispute between the parties over what if something was damaged? I'm going to get to that in just a minute. I'll promise I'll answer your question, Kim. So the first part is some confusion. And so what I always do, and I recommend that agents at some point get a temporary occupancy for seller addendum or the actual form signed at some point before the closing or during the closing, which says keys are going to be exchanged at this time on this date, and that's when possession is going to be delivered. Other things that happen in the bad possession category is the seller leaves debris. It's just junk, paint cans, the place hasn't been cleaned up, whatever. Bad possession could be the seller takes some fixtures which the buyer believed were included. Maybe a chandelier that was was grandma's chandelier, and they want to take that, but they don't tell anybody about it. Maybe they take appliances that the buyer believed were included in the purchase agreement. Bad possession could be the furnace stops working 3 days after closing. Whose responsibility is that if the furnace stops working 3 days after closing and the seller is still living in the property and will be for another 10 to 15, 30 days? That's the buyer's responsibility. The buyer is now responsible for the home as of closing, and the seller is essentially a renter. Let's say that in the process of moving, the seller scratches the hardwood floors, knocks the handrail off, and damages the drywall. I had this happen just recently on my own transaction. They actually yanked the handrail off and left big holes, and then scratched the hardwood floors when they dragged the appliances out that they weren't supposed to take with them. So it happens. It happens to all of us, including myself. And so, but generally speaking, those bad possession issues can be resolved, if there is no escrow, can be resolved for a few $100s. And that may be a negotiation between the buyer and seller. It may be something that the agents want to participate in. All of those things are possibilities. That's not, those aren't the ugly ones. Those are bad. Generally speaking, though, they can be resolved relatively painlessly. Here's the ugly ones. Buyer discovers water in the basement which was not disclosed on the seller's disclosure of condition. That's a biggie. Buyer discovered mold or other hidden material defect, a crack in the wall, a leak in the roof. The property is left like a hoarder's house with piles of stuff. The seller leaves rusted out cars and farm implements on the property and the outbuildings. And in the outbuildings. Extreme and intentional damage, that's a biggie. For example, they've got extremely, very, very expensive hardwood floors, and they drag something metal across them and gouge it. It may require a replacement of the floor. And as I pointed out, with appliances, the sky's the limit. Appliances can get into tens of thousands of dollars. So how do you do that? What do you do in that situation? In that situation where there's potential for a lot of damage or very costly damage, you may want to consider an escrow agreement. And I'll give you some language on that in just a moment. How much do you escrow? I don't know. It's really a judgment call. But in a conversation with Joe Hamilton, he talked with me the other day about this form, this temporary occupancy for seller after closing. If you've never seen this, it's in dot loop in the buyer's package. So I encourage you to go in and read it closely. But I want to hit a few high points. First of all, in paragraph 1, it says, after closing, seller shall have a temporary license to occupy the property until some time, I said here 1:00 p.m., on 15 days after closing. You could do that, or you could be specific and say January 30th, 2020, for a non-refundable fee of, let's just say, $1,000, payable in advance at closing. Seller shall vacate the property no later than the end of the date on the occupancy period. Okay? Item 2, during the occupancy period, the seller will maintain all utilities in the seller's name. Well, that kind of clears that question up that comes every now and then. The buyer will maintain the structure and mechanical systems at the property. The buyer will maintain the structure and mechanical systems in the property. However, the seller shall be liable for the expense of repairing any damage to the property caused by misuse, neglect, abuse, and so on, by the seller or the seller's family. Seller shall not make any modifications to the property. In other words, they can't put out a new room or something. Number 5, I'm going to drop down to number 5. If the property is destroyed by fire or other occurrence during the occupancy period, seller shall bear the risk of loss to seller's personal property. It's no longer their house. The buyer has to have fire and hazard insurance on the structure as of the date of closing. That's the buyer's responsibility, not the seller's. After closing, the only thing the seller is responsible to ensure for their own safety is their personal belongings. It says that right there. If they don't get out when they say they're going to get out, now you have a situation where they are a tenant at sufferance. And usually, as Joe put in this one, it says $500 a day. Well, for $1,500 or $15,000, I'd probably get out pretty quick. Yeah, for 30 days possession, I'd probably get out pretty fast at $500 a day. I could get a pretty nice hotel room for that. In the event of a breach of this addendum, the prevailing party in any litigation shall be entitled to recover their costs and attorney's fees. Seller may not assign his or her rights under this agreement. So, that's a really helpful document in helping your buyer understand what their rights are and the seller to understand what their responsibilities are after the closing. So, what happens with the escrow? Well, first of all, in order to have that question, Kim, you have to have an escrow. And so I'm going to read to you one that Tim Updike provided me, and with a couple of thoughts. On a recent transaction that Tim was involved with, he said, seller to remove, this was in an addendum, which was then translated into an escrow agreement by the title company, and the title company was going to hold the escrow funds, albeit they were able to get things worked out and not actually to have to do the escrow. But Tim put together some pretty good language, and I'm going to share it with you. Seller to remove all boats, cars, tools, trailers, blah, 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 from the garage's property and agrees to remove the above-ground pool located toward the south end of the property. If these items are not removed prior to closing, seller agrees to have Star Title hold up to $6,000 in an escrow account, which will be released upon removal of all above listed items. Seller will have no later than 60 days after closing to remove items listed above. If seller cannot completely remove these items, the $6,000 escrow funds will be given to buyers to help cover the cost of dumpsters, labor, and contractor time to remove said items. Seller additionally allows 120 days to remove sailboat and blah, blah, blah. In addition to that, I said, I asked him, what would happen if the buyer got there and everything was fine? So what I would add to this is that if the property is delivered to buyer in acceptable condition per buyer's sole discretion, buyer agrees to release escrow funds immediately. That might be something that you want to add. And we can actually write that up and put that in dot loop. So, Kim, what happens, back to Kim's question, what happens with the escrow if there is a dispute? Well, immediately, if we discover that there's a dispute, the buyer will make a claim. The buyer should have in this example that I shared, the buyer's going to make a claim. They're going to say it's going to cost $5,000 to hire people to remove, to get dumpsters in there, hire people to remove the junk, get the sailboat out, and all of those things. They are going to make a claim against that escrow account immediately. Now, the seller can agree to that and say, yeah, okay, you know, I kind of left in a hurry, left in a mess, I get it. So they can agree to that, or they can say no, in which case both parties are going to have to hire an attorney. It's as simple as that. We do not have the power to enforce a contract, nor do we have the power to enforce an escrow agreement. So both parties are going to have to go to their attorneys and say, we have a mess on our hands. The new buyer of this property feels as though there's $5,000 damage because of the way the property was left. We have, let's say, $6,000 in the escrow account that was held back, and we want to make a claim against that $6,000 for $5,000 that the buyer is going to have to pay out, and hopefully will be reimbursed. If they can't come to an agreement on how that escrow is dispersed, it's going to be up to the attorneys. It's going to have to be resolved in court. We do not have the power to enforce an escrow agreement, nor do we have the power to enforce a contract. Any others? Thank you, Penny. I appreciate that. I hope that was helpful. I really found those two forms, the termination, oops, sorry, what was the name of that? The addendum really spells out what the responsibilities, the temporary occupancy for seller after closing, really spells out whose responsibility it is to keep the lights on, to keep the insurance in force, and who pays for what if there's damages. And the escrow information in the purchase agreement is really helpful too. And ultimately, the choice about what to ask for, if you ask for an escrow agreement, is up. You know, what's the potential damage that a buyer is going to experience? It's hard to say, but the pricier the house, the more possibility of damage. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions, add them here. I'll answer them throughout the day and this evening or whenever you have an opportunity to watch the video. Thanks for joining. See you next week.